The anatomy of the midbrain. The midbrain measures 2 centimeters in length and connects the pons and the cerebellum with the forebrain. It has the cerebral aqueduct, which is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. On the posterior surface, there are 4 colliculi called the corpora quadrigemina. These are rounded structures that are divided into superior and inferior pairs by a vertical and transverse groove. The superior colliculi are centers for visual reflexes, while the inferior colliculi are lower auditory centers. On the lateral aspect of the midbrain, the superior brachium passes from the superior colliculus to the LGB, which is the lateral geniculate body, and the optic tract. The inferior brachium connects the inferior colliculus to the medial geniculate body. On the anterior aspect of the midbrain, there is a deep depression in the midline, the interpeduncular fossa, which is bounded on either side by the crus cerebri. There are many small blood vessels which perforate the floor of this interpeduncular fossa, and therefore it's called the posterior perforated substance. The oculomotor nerve emerges from a groove on the medial side of the crus cerebri and passes forward in the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus. The midbrain has 2 lateral halves called the cerebral peduncles. Each of these is divided into an anterior part called the crus cerebri and the posterior part, which is called the tegmentum, by a pigmented band of gray matter called the substantia nigra. The cerebral aqueduct is the canal which connects the 3rd and the 4th ventricles. The tectum is the part of the midbrain posterior to the cerebral aqueduct. The transverse section of the midbrain at the level of the inferior colliculi. The inferior colliculus receives many of the terminal fibers of the lateral lemniscus. The pathway then continues through the inferior brachium to the medial geniculate body. The trochlear nucleus at the level of the inferior colliculi is situated in the central gray matter, close to the median plane, just posterior to the medial longitudinal fasciculus. The emerging fibers of the trochlear nucleus pass laterally and posteriorly around the central gray matter and leave the midbrain just below the inferior colliculi. The fibers of the 4th nerve, which is the trochlear nerve, now decussate completely in the superior medullary velum. Another point to note is the spinal and trigeminal lemnisci are situated lateral to the medial lemniscus. The lateral lemniscus is located posterior to the trigeminal lemniscus. The substantia nigra is a large motor nucleus that's situated between the tegmentum and the crus cerebri, and it's found throughout the midbrain. The crus cerebri consists of corticospinal and corticonuclear fibers which occupy the middle 2/3 of the crus. At the level of the superior colliculi, you have the superior colliculi, which form part of the visual reflexes, and they're connected to the lateral geniculate body by the superior brachium, and they receive afferent fibers from the optic nerve, visual cortex, and the spinotectal tract. The efferent fibers from the superior colliculi form the tectospinal and tectobulbar tracts, and they are responsible for the reflex movements of the eyes, head, and neck in response to visual stimuli. The afferent pathway for the light reflex ends in the pretectal nucleus. From there, it goes to the parasympathetic nucleus of the oculomotor nerve, which is called the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. And the emerging fibers from there pass to the oculomotor nerve, which is situated in the central gray matter close to the median plane, just posterior to the medial longitudinal fasciculus. The red nucleus has a rounded mass of gray matter situated between the cerebral aqueduct and the substantia nigra. Afferent fibers reach the red nucleus from the cerebral cortex, from the cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncle, the lentiform nucleus, subthalamic and hypothalamic nuclei, substantia nigra, and the spinal cord, while the efferent fibers leave the red nucleus and pass to the spinal cord through rubrospinal tracts. The reticular formation is situated in the tegmentum, lateral and posterior to the red nucleus. The pons. The pons is anterior to the cerebellum and it connects the medulla to the midbrain. It's about 1 inch long. The anterior or the ventral surface is convex from side to side and has many transverse fibers that converge on each side to form the middle cerebellar peduncle. It has a basilar groove which lodges the basilar artery. On the anterior surface of the pons, the trigeminal nerve emerges on each side. Each nerve consists of a smaller medial part, motor root, and a larger lateral part, which is the sensory root. In the groove between the pons and the medulla, there emerge from medial to lateral the abducent or the 6th nerve, the facial of the 7th nerve, and the vestibulocochlear of the 8th nerves. The posterior surface of the pons is hidden from view by the cerebellum. It forms the upper half of the floor of the 4th ventricle and it is triangular in shape. The lower half of the floor of the 4th ventricle is formed by the upper part of the medulla. The caudal pons. This has a facial colliculus which is produced by the root of the facial nerve which winds around the nucleus of the abducent nerve. The medial lemniscus is situated in the most anterior part of the tegmentum and is accompanied by the spinal and lateral lemnisci. The spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve and its tract lie on the anteromedial aspect of the inferior cerebellar peduncle. The medial longitudinal fasciculus is situated beneath the floor of the 4th ventricle on either side of the midline. We also see the trapezoid body, which is made up of fibers derived from the cochlear nuclei and the nuclei of the trapezoid body. The basilar part of the pons at this level contains pontine nuclei. Corticopontine fibers of the crus cerebri of the midbrain end in the pontine nuclei. The transverse fibers of the pons enter the middle cerebellar peduncle and is distributed to the cerebellar hemisphere. The cranial pons. This has motor and principal or chief sensory nuclei of the trigeminal nerve. The motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve is situated beneath the lateral part of the 4th ventricle and the chief sensory nucleus of the trigeminal nerve is on the lateral side of this motor nucleus. This is continuous inferiorly with the nucleus of the spinal tract. The superior cerebellar peduncle is situated posterior lateral to the motor nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. It is joined by the anterior spinal cerebellar tract. The trapezoid body and the medial lemniscus are situated in the same position. The lateral and spinal lemnisci lie at the lateral extremity of the medial lemniscus. The medulla. The medulla connects the pons superiorly with the spinal cord inferiorly. The central canal of the spinal cord continues upward into the lower half of the medulla. In the upper half of the medulla, it expands as a cavity of the 4th ventricle. On the anterior surface of the medulla is the anterior median fissure. This is continuous inferiorly with the anterior median fissure of the spinal cord. On each side of the median fissure, there is a swelling called the pyramid. The pyramids are composed of corticospinal fibers, which originate in the large nerve cells in the precentral gyrus of the cerebral cortex. The pyramids decussate in the inferior part of the medulla. Posterior-lateral to the pyramids, there are olives, which are oval elevations produced by the underlying inferior olivular nuclei. In the groove between the pyramid and the olive, there emerge rootlets of the hypoglossal nerve, and posterior to the olives are the inferior cerebellar peduncles. At the level of decussation of the pyramids, which is the lowest part of the medulla, you have the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus, which continue above to form the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. You also see the inferior end of the nucleus of the spinal tract of trigeminal nerve, which becomes continuous with the substantia gelatinosa in the posterior gray column of the spinal cord. At the level of the decussation of the lemnisci, just above the previous level, this takes place anterior to the central gray matter and posterior to the pyramids. The medial lemnisci are formed from the internal arcuate fibers which emerge from the anterior aspects of the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. The nucleus of the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve lies lateral to the internal arcuate fibers. The spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve lies lateral to this nucleus. Lateral and anterior spinothalamic and spinotectal tracts occupy an area lateral to the decussation of the lemnisci and are collectively called the spinal lemniscus. The spinocerebellar, vestibulospinal, and rubrospinal tracts are situated in the anterolateral region of the medulla oblongata. At the level of the olives, you have the inferior olivary nucleus, which is a gray matter which is shaped in the form of a crumbled bag with its mouth directed medially. It sends fibers medially across the midline to enter the cerebellum through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Afferent fibers reach the inferior olivary nuclei from the spinal cord and from the cerebellum and the cerebral cortex. You also see the vestibulocochlear nuclei, which consist of medial, inferior, lateral, and superior nuclei. You also see two cochlear nuclei, anterior and posterior. And you see the nucleus ambiguus, which consists of a large group of motor neurons that are situated deep within the reticular formation. The emerging nerve fibers join glossopharyngeal, vagus, and cranial part of the accessory nerve. The central gray matter, it lies beneath the floor of the fourth ventricle. Passing from the medial to the lateral, it has the hypoglossal nucleus, the dorsal nucleus of the vagus, the nucleus of the tractus solitarius, and the medial and inferior vestibular nuclei. The medial longitudinal fasciculus forms a small tract of nerve fibers on each side of the midline, posterior to the medial lemniscus and anterior to the hypoglossal nucleus. The inferior cerebellar peduncle is situated in the posterior lateral corner, and anterior to it you find the spinal tract of the trigeminal nerve and its nucleus. The anterior spinocerebellar tract is situated near the surface in the interval between the inferior olivary nucleus and the nucleus of the spinal tract of trigeminal nerve. The reticular formation consists of a diffuse mixture of nerve fibers and nerve cells and is deeply placed posterior to the olivary nucleus.